It is cold at 6:40 in the morning of a March day in Paris, and seems even colder when a man is about to be executed by firing squad. At that hour, on the 11th of March 1963, in the main courtyard of the Fort-d'Ivry, a French Air Force colonel stood before a stake driven into the chilly gravel as his hands were bound behind the post, and stared at the squad of soldiers facing him 20 meters away. A foot scuffed the grit as the blindfold was wrapped around the eyes of Lieutenant Colonel Jean-Marie Bastien-Thiry, blotting out the light for the last time. The mumbling of the priest was a counterpoint to the crackling of 20 rifle bolts as the soldiers charged and cocked their carbines. The crash of rifle fire, when it came, caused no ripple on the surface of the waking city, other than to send a flutter of pigeons skywards for a few moments. The death of the officer, leader of a gang of secret army organization killers who had tried to assassinate the President of France at Petit Clamart, a suburb of Paris, was to have been an end to further attempts on the President's life. By a quirk of fate, it marked a beginning. The execution was reported on the 8 a.m. news of Radio Europe No. 1 in French, and was heard in most parts of Western Europe. In a small hotel room in Austria, the broadcast was to set off a train of events that brought General de Gaulle nearer to death than at any time in his career. The room was that of Colonel Marc Rodin, operations chief of the OAS. Rodin was the son of a cobbler. He had escaped to England by fishing boat in the halcyon days of his late teens, when the Germans overran France, and had enlisted as a private soldier under the banner of the Cross of Lorraine. Promotion through sergeant to warrant officer had come the hard way, in bloody battles across North Africa and Normandy. A field commission during the fight for Paris had got him the officer's chevrons his education and breeding could never have obtained. And in post-war France, the choice had been between reverting to civilian life or staying in the army. He joined one of the tough colonial regiments, and within a year he was a company commander in Indochina. By the end of the Indochina campaign, he was a major. After an unhappy and frustrating year back in France, he was sent to Algeria. The French withdrawal from Indochina and the year he spent in France had turned his latent bitterness into a consuming loathing of politicians and communists, whom he regarded as one and the same thing. Not until France was ruled by a soldier could she ever be weaned away from the grip of the traitors and lickspittles who permeated her public life. He remained convinced that given enough backing by the civil authorities on the spot and the government back home, the army could have beaten the Viet Minh. The cession of Indochina had been a massive betrayal of the thousands of fine young men who had died there, seemingly for nothing. For Rodin there could be, no more betrayals. Algeria would prove it. He left the shore of Marseille in the spring of 1956 as near a happy man as he would ever be, convinced that the distant hills of Algeria would see the consummation of what he regarded as his life's work, the apotheosis of the French army in the eyes of the world. In June 1958, General de Gaulle returned to power as Prime Minister of France. Efficiently disposing of the corrupt and tottering Fourth Republic, he founded the Fifth. When he visited Algeria, his presence was for Rodin like that of Zeus coming down from Olympus. The new policy, he was sure, was on the way. The communists would be swept from their offices, the trade unions would be brought into submission, and the final wholehearted backing of France for her kith and kin in Algeria, and for her army protecting the frontiers of French civilization, would be forthcoming. When the first rumors of preliminary talks with Ben Bella and the FLN filtered through, Rodin could not believe it. Still, de Gaulle, he felt sure, must know what he was doing. Had he not said it? The golden words, Algérie française. When the proof finally came that de Gaulle's concept of a resuscitated France did not include a French Algeria, Rodin's world disintegrated. Of faith and hope, belief and confidence, there was nothing left. Just hate. Hate for the system, for the politicians, for the intellectuals, for the Algerians, for the trade unions, but most of all, hate for that man. Rodin led his entire battalion into the military putsch of April 1961. It failed, destroyed by de Gaulle before it could get off the ground. The mutiny was broken like the illusions. Rodin had been luckier than some. 120 of his officers, NCOs, and rankers remained with him. This was because he commanded a unit with a higher proportion of old sweats from Indochina and Algeria than most. Together they formed the OAS, the secret army organization, pledged to overthrow the Judas of the Élysée Palace. When faced with his own concept of France and the honor of the army, Rodin was as bigoted as the rest. But when faced with a purely practical problem, he could bring to bear a pragmatic and logical concentration that was more effective than all the volatile enthusiasm and senseless violence in the world. This was what he brought on the morning of 11th of March to the problem of killing de Gaulle. He was not fool enough to think the job would be easy. Killers alone were not hard to find. The problem was to find a man or a plan that had one single factor built in that would be sufficiently unusual to penetrate the wall of security now built in concentric rings round the person of the president. Things had changed since Petit Clamart. The penetration of the Secret Service into the ranks of the OAS had increased to an alarming degree. The whole OAS leadership had had to go on the run. There had been a rush for false papers, tickets to far places. Any new plan set up at this stage, which involved a lot of planning and coordination of many groups, would be blown before the assassin could get within 100 miles of de Gaulle. Rodin ran through the list of men whom he knew would not flinch from assassinating a president. Every one had a file thick as the Bible in French police headquarters. Arriving at the end of his own argument, Rodin muttered, "A man who is not known." The answer came to him just before noon. He dismissed it for a while, but was drawn back to it with insistent curiosity. If such a man could be found, if only such a man existed. Slowly, laboriously, he built a plan around such a man, then subjected it to all the obstacles and objections. The plan passed them all, even the question of security. He lunched frugally, and by mid-afternoon he was gone, bags packed, bill paid, departed on a lonely mission to find a man, or more precisely a type of man, whom he did not know existed. It was 90 days before Rodin's search was over, and what he had to show for it was a slim dossier which he kept with him permanently in his briefcase. In the middle of June, he arrived back in Austria and checked into a small boarding house in the Bruckner Allee in Vienna. From the city's main post office, he sent off 2 telegrams, one to Bolzano in northern Italy, the other to Rome. Each summoned his 2 principal lieutenants to an urgent meeting in his room in Vienna. Within 24 hours the men had arrived. René Montclair by hired car from Bolzano, and André Casson by plane from Rome. Rodin took his seat behind his desk and carefully and methodically began his briefing, concentrating on the growing list of failures and defeats the OAS had sustained at the hands of the French Secret Service over the past few months. His guests stared gloomily into their glasses. "We simply must face facts," he concluded. "In the past 4 months, we have taken 3 severe blows. The frustration of the École Militaire attempt to free France of the dictator is merely the latest in a long list of such attempts which have failed even to get off the ground. We have now reached a position where the prime aim of our cause to liberate France, the disposal of de Gaulle, without which all further plans must inevitably abort, has become virtually impossible by the traditional means. There are too many squealers, too many backsliders. The secret police have now so completely infiltrated the movement that they seem to know within days of the decision being taken what we intend. What are our plans? Who are our personnel? There is only one method remaining to accomplish our objective in a manner that will bypass the whole network of spies and agents, leave the secret police stripped of its advantages, and face them with a situation of which they are not only unaware, but which they could hardly frustrate even if they knew about it. I believe, gentlemen, that the only alternative left to us is to engage the services of an outsider. Montclair and Casson gazed at him in amazement. It would be necessary for this man, whoever he is, to be a foreigner, said Rodin. He would not be a member of the OAS, he would not be known to any policeman in France, nor would he exist on any file. He would travel under a foreign passport, do the job, and disappear back to his own country. Montclair let out a low whistle. A professional assassin, he said softly. Precisely, replied Rodin. Now, it would be quite unreasonable to suppose that an outsider is going to do such a job for love or for patriotism. Such a man would only work for money. I have summoned you here because I am utterly convinced of your loyalty to the cause and your ability to retain a secret. Moreover, for the plan I have in mind, the active cooperation of you, René, as treasurer and paymaster is necessary to meet the hire that any professional assassin would undoubtedly demand. Your cooperation, André, will be necessary to ensure such a man of the assistance inside France of a small handful of men loyal beyond doubt in case he should have to call on them. But I see no reason why details of the idea should go further than we three. I am therefore proposing to you that we form a committee of ourselves to take the entire responsibility for this idea, its planning, execution, and subsidization. Now, let us get down to details. The idea of using a professional mercenary assassin first occurred to me on the day I heard over the radio that poor Bastien-Thiry had been murdered. Since that time, I have been searching for the man we want. The outcome can be summed up in this. He picked up the dossier from his desk and handed it over to Montclair, who opened it and started to read. 5 minutes later, he silently handed the dossier to Casson, who read through the slim file quickly but thoroughly, then closed it and handed it back to Rodin. There was a moment's silence. Then Casson said, "Are you sure about this Englishman? Has he really done those jobs?" "As regards absolute proof," said Rodin, "there is none. If there were, it would be a bad sign. It would mean he would be listed everywhere as an undesirable immigrant. As it is, there is nothing against him but rumor. This Englishman has all the advantages but one. He will not be cheap. A man like him can ask a lot of money. We have to raise that money from somewhere. On the other hand, there would be no point getting into that kind of action until we know how much we shall need." "Which presumes," cut in Casson, "that the next step is to contact the Englishman and ask him if he will do the job, and for how much." "Yes. Are we all agreed on that?" Rodin glanced at both men in turn. Both nodded. Rodin looked at his watch. "I have an agent in London whom I must telephone now and ask him to contact this man to ask him to come here. If he is prepared to fly to Vienna on the evening plane, we could meet him here after dinner tonight." Rodin ushered the Englishman inside the bedroom. It had been arranged like an office for a recruiting board. The escritoire served for the chairman's desk and was littered with papers. Behind it were 3 chairs, 2 of which were occupied by Montclair and Casson, who eyed the visitor curiously. The Englishman sat down casually in an easy chair, and Rodin took his seat behind the desk. For a few seconds, He stared at the man from London. What he saw did not displease him. The visitor stood about 6 feet tall, apparently in his early 30s, and with a lean, athletic build. He looked fit. The face was sun-tanned with regular features, and the hands lay quietly along the arms of the chair. He looked like a man who retained control of himself. But the eyes bothered Rodin. They had no expression at all. Nothing came through, and Rodin felt a worm of unease. Like all men created by systems and procedures, he did not like the unpredictable, and therefore the uncontrollable. "We know who you are," he began abruptly. "I had better introduce myself. I am Colonel Marc Rodin." "I know," said the Englishman. "You are chief of the operations of the OAS, and your two friends are Major René Montclair, treasurer, and Monsieur André Casson, head of the OAS underground in France. Colonel, let us be frank. You have been making inquiries about me. It is impossible to make such inquiries without the news of them soon getting back to the man being asked about. Naturally, I wish to know who was so interested in me. It could have been someone wishing to employ me, or someone seeking revenge. As soon as I discovered the identity of the organization interested in me, 2 days among the French newspaper files in the British Museum were enough to tell me about you and your organization. I know who you are. What I would like to know is what you want." There was silence for several minutes. Then Rodin said, "Since you have read the files available, I will not bore you with the motivations behind our organization. We believe France is now ruled by a dictator who has polluted our country and prostituted its honor. We believe his regime can only fall and France be restored to Frenchmen if he first dies. Out of 6 attempts by our supporters to eliminate him, 3 were exposed in the early planning stages, 1 was betrayed the day before the attempt, and 2 took place but misfired. We are considering, but only at this stage considering, engaging the services of a professional to do the job. However, we do not wish to waste our money. The first thing we would like to know is if it is possible." "There's no man in the world who's proof against an assassin's bullet," said the Englishman. "Of course it's possible to kill de Gaulle. The point is that the chances of escape would not be too high. A fanatic prepared to die himself in the attempt is always the most certain method of eliminating a dictator who exposes himself to the public. But I notice that despite your idealism, you've not been able to produce such a man." "And as regards a professional?" prompted Rodin. "A professional does not act out of fervor, and is therefore more calm and less likely to make elementary errors. Being a professional, he has calculated the risks to the last contingency. But he will not even enter into operation until he has devised a plan that will enable him to escape unharmed." "Do you estimate that such a plan could be worked out to permit a professional to kill de Gaulle?" asked Rodin. "It would be extremely difficult, more so than with most other targets, because de Gaulle is forewarned, not about the specific attempt, but about the general intention. All big men have bodyguards and security men, but over a period of years without any serious attempt on the life of the big man, the checks become formal, the routines mechanical, and the degree of watchfulness is lowered. The single bullet that finishes the target is wholly unexpected and therefore provokes panic. Under cover of this, the assassin escapes. In this case, there will be no lowering of the level of watchfulness, and if the bullet was to get to the target, there would be many who would not panic, but would go for the assassin. Could be done, but it would be one of the hardest jobs in the world at this moment. You see, gentlemen, not only have your own efforts failed, but they've queered the pitch for everyone else. But you didn't call me here for a chat in general terms about the theory of political assassination. You called me here because your organization is so infiltrated by the French Secret Service that little you decide remains secret for long. Therefore, you need an outsider, and you're right. The only questions that remain are who and for how much. Now, gentlemen, I think you've had long enough to examine the merchandise, don't you? Rodin looked sideways at Montclair and raised an eyebrow. Montclair nodded. Casson followed suit. The Englishman gazed out of the window without a shred of interest. "Will you assassinate de Gaulle?" asked Rodin at last. The voice was quiet, but the question filled the room. The Englishman's glance came back to him, and the eyes were blank again. "Yes, but it'll cost a lot of money." "How much?" asked Montclair. "500,000. Rodin glanced at Montclair, who grimaced. "That's a lot of money, 500,000 new francs." "Dollars," said the Englishman. "Half in advance and half on completion." $500,000, shouted Montclair, rising from his seat. "You're crazy." "No," said the Englishman calmly, "but I am the best, and therefore the most expensive. When you employ the best, you pay. $500,000 is the price. Considering you expect to get France itself, you esteem your country very cheap." "The point is," said Rodin, "we do not have $500,000. "I'm aware of that," replied the Englishman. "If you want the job done, you'll have to find that sum from somewhere. I don't need the job, you understand, but the idea of having enough to retire on is appealing. Therefore, I am prepared to take some exceptionally high risks for that prize. If you cannot acquire the sum involved, then you must go back to arranging your own plots and seeing them destroyed by the authorities one by one." There was a pause, and then Rodin said, "We shall get the money, monsieur." "Good," said the Englishman. "But there are also conditions. How many people in your organization know of this idea of yours?" "Just the three of us in this room," said Rodin. "Then it must remain that way," said the Englishman. "All records, files, and dossiers must be destroyed. There must be nothing available outside your three heads. You must remain somewhere safe and under heavy guard until the job is done. The planning will be mine, as will the operation. I shall divulge the details to no one, not even to you. In short, I shall disappear. You have my telephone number in London and my address, but I shall be leaving both as soon as I'm ready to move. In any event, you will only contact me at that place in an emergency. I shall leave you the name of my bank in Switzerland. When they tell me the first $250,000 has been deposited, or when I am fully ready, whichever is the later, I shall move. I will not be hurried beyond my own judgment, nor will I be subject to interference. When you're ready, send me by mail a single telephone number, preferably in Paris, so that I can ring that number direct from anywhere in France. I will not give anyone my own whereabouts, but simply ring that number for latest information about the security situation surrounding the President." "Very well," said Rodin. "Monsieur wishes to work alone. So be it. Now, if that is all, I don't think we need detain our guest any longer. Oh, there is one last point. If you wish to remain anonymous, you should have a code name." The Englishman thought for a moment. "Since the operation bears a certain resemblance to a hunting trip," he said, "what about the Jackal? Will that do?" Rodin nodded. "Yes, that will do fine. In fact, I think I like it." He escorted the Englishman to the door and opened it. "We will be in touch in the agreed manner as soon as we can," he said. "Bonsoir, Monsieur Jackal." After the Englishman had gone, there was silence in the room for several minutes. Then Montclair said gloomily, $500,000. We may have to rob a few banks. During June and July of 1963, France was rocked by an outbreak of violent crimes against banks, jewelers' shops, and post offices. From one end of the country to the other, banks were held up with pistols, sawn-off shotguns, and submachine guns on an almost daily basis. Smash-and-grab raids at jewelers' shops became commonplace. In response to pressure from bankers and jewelers, who complained bitterly to the government about this crime wave, police checks on banks at night were increased in frequency, but to no avail, since the robbers were not professional cracksmen able to open a bank vault skillfully during the hours of darkness, but simply thugs in masks, armed and ready to shoot if provoked in the slightest way. In the last week of June, a report landed on the desk of Colonel Roland, the head of the Secret Service, from the chief of his permanent office in Rome. It was to the effect that the three top men of the OAS, Rodin, Montclair, and Casson, had taken up residence together on the top floor of a hotel just off the Via Condotti. They had taken the entire top floor for themselves, and the floor below for their bodyguards. They were being guarded night and day by 8 extremely tough ex-members of the Foreign Legion, and were not venturing out at all. At first it was thought that they'd met for a conference, but as the days passed, it became apparent that they were simply taking exceptionally heavy precautions. Roland smothered a small shadow of misgiving as he surveyed the report, and asked himself why a man like Rodin should scare that easily. In London, the Jackal spent the last fortnight of June reading every word written about or by Charles de Gaulle. By the simple expedient of going to the local lending library and looking up the entry for the French president in the Encyclopaedia Britannica, he found a comprehensive list of reference books about his subject. He wrote off to various bookshops, using a false name and a forwarding address in Paddington, and acquired the necessary reference books by post. These he scoured until the small hours each morning in his flat, building up in his mind a most detailed picture of the incumbent of the Élysée Palace from his boyhood until the time of reading. But although his reading provided a full picture of the proud and disdainful President of France, it still did not solve the main question that had been baffling him since he had accepted the assignment to go through with the assassination. By the end of the first week in July, he had still not worked out the answer to this question. When, where, and how should the hit take place? As a last resort, he went down to the reading room of the British Museum, and after signing his application for permission to research with his habitual false name, started to work his way through the back copies of France's leading daily newspaper, Le Figaro. Starting with the germ of an idea triggered by a columnist writing in 1962, cross-checking back through the files covering every year of de Gaulle's presidency since 1945, the assassin decided precisely on what day, come illness or bad weather, totally regardless of any considerations of personal danger, de Gaulle would stand up publicly and show himself. From that point on, the Jackal's preparations moved out of the research stage and into that of practical planning. It took long hours of thought before the last detail had clicked into place. At least a dozen ideas were considered and rejected before he finally hit on the plan he decided to adopt, the how that had to be added to the when and where that he had already decided. The Jackal was perfectly aware that in 1963 de Gaulle was the most closely and skillfully guarded figure in the Western world. The whole security apparatus around him was in a state of permanent forewarning of the likelihood of some attempt being made on his life. On the credit side, he could reasonably bank on his own anonymity and on the choleric refusal of his victim to cooperate with his own security forces. On the chosen day, the pride, the stubbornness, and the absolute contempt for personal danger of the French president would force him to come out into the open, no matter what the risks involved. During the second week of July, the Jackal took a car trip through the Thames Valley looking for small villages. In the third cemetery he visited, he found a gravestone to suit his purpose, that of Alexander Duggan, who had died at the age of 2.5 years in 1931. Had he lived, the Duggan child would have been a few months older than the Jackal in July 1963. The vicar was courteous and helpful when the visitor presented himself at the vicarage to announce that he was an amateur genealogist engaged in attempting to trace the family tree of the Duggans. The record showed both the Duggan parents had died over the past 7 years, and their only son, Alexander, had been buried in this very churchyard over 30 years before. The Jackal idly turned over the pages in the parish register of births, marriages, and deaths for 1929, and for the month of April, the name of Duggan caught his eye. Alexander Duggan, born 3rd of April 1929, in the parish of St. Mark's, Sambourne. He noted the details, thanked the vicar profusely, and left. Back in London, he presented himself at the Central Registry of Births, Marriages and Deaths, where a helpful young assistant accepted without query his visiting card showing him to be a partner in a firm of solicitors of Market Drayton, Shropshire, and his explanation that he was engaged in trying to trace the whereabouts of the grandchildren of one of the firm's clients. One of these grandchildren was Alexander Duggan. A search of the records showed that the child had been registered precisely according to the inquirer's information, but had died on the 8th of November 1931 as the result of a road accident. For a few shillings, the Jackal received a copy of both the birth and death certificates. Before returning home, he stopped at a branch office of the Ministry of Labour and was issued with a passport application form, and at a toy shop where he bought a child's printing set. Back in his flat, he filled in the application form in Duggan's name, giving exactly the right age, date of birth, etc., but his own personal description. He wrote in his own height, colour of hair and eyes, and profession put down businessman. The full names of Duggan's parents, taken from the child's birth certificate, were also filled in. For the referee, he filled in the name of the Reverend James Elderly, Vicar of St. Mark's, Sambourne, to whom he had spoken that morning, and whose full name and title of Doctor of Divinity had been printed on a board outside the church. The vicar's signature was forged in a thin hand, and from the printing set he made up a stamp reading St. Mark's Parish Church, Sambourne, which was placed firmly next to the vicar's name. The copy of the birth certificate, the application form, and a postal order for £1 were sent off to the passport office. The brand new passport arrived at the accommodation address by post 4 days later. The SAS airliner from Copenhagen made one last swing into line in front of the terminal building at London, trundled forward a few feet, and halted. Within a few minutes, the steps were wheeled up, and the passengers started to file out. On the observation terrace, the blond man applied his eyes to a pair of binoculars. The file of passengers coming down the steps was the sixth that morning to be subjected to this kind of scrutiny. But as the terrace was crowded, the watch's behaviour aroused no interest. As the eighth passenger emerged into the light, the man on the terrace tensed slightly, and with the binoculars followed the new arrival down the steps. The passenger from Denmark was a pastor, wearing a clerical grey suit with a dog collar. He appeared to be in his late 40s from the iron grey hair cut at medium length and brushed back from the forehead, but the face was youthful. He was a tall man, with wide shoulders, and he looked physically fit. He had approximately the same build as the man who watched him from the terrace above. When the Danish pastor came out of the main hall to board the BEA coach to the Cromwell Road terminal, the Englishman was a few paces behind him, and they travelled into London on the same coach. At the terminal, the Dane waited while his suitcase was unloaded, then wended his way past the checking-in counters to the exit sign marked taxis. While he did so, the Jackal strode round the back of the coach and across the coach park to where he had left his car. He climbed in and started up. Bringing the car to a halt close to the left-hand wall of the terminal, from where he could glance to the right down the line of waiting taxis. The Dane climbed into the third taxi, which cruised off into Cromwell Road, heading towards Knightsbridge. The sports car followed. The taxi dropped the priest at a small hotel in Half Moon Street, while the sports car shot past the entrance, and within a few minutes had found a spare parking meter on the far side of Curzon Street. The Jackal was back in the foyer of the hotel within 5 minutes. He had to wait another 25 minutes before the Dane came downstairs and handed back his room key to the receptionist. After she hung it up, the key swayed for a few seconds from the hook, and the Jackal noted that the number of the key was 47. A few minutes later, he slipped quietly and unnoticed up the stairs. A 2-inch wide strip of flexible mica was enough to open the door of room 47. The pastor had left his passport on the bedside table, and the Jackal was back in the corridor within 30 seconds. It was not until much later in the afternoon, after a thorough and mystified search of his room, that the pastor mentioned the disappearance of his passport to the manager. The manager also searched the room, and after pointing out that everything else, including the wallet of traveller's checks, was intact, brought all his advocacy to bear to persuade his bewildered guest that there was no need to bring the police to the hotel, since he had evidently lost his passport somewhere in transit. The Dane agreed, and reported the loss to the Danish Consulate General the next day. He was issued with travel documents with which to return to Copenhagen at the end of his fortnight's stay in London. The clerk at the Consulate General who issued the travel documents filed the loss of a passport in the name of Pastor Per Jensen of Copenhagen, and thought no more about it. The date was the 14th of July. On the 19th of July, the Jackal took the afternoon flight to Copenhagen. In the Danish capital, he bought a lightweight clerical grey suit at one of the best-known men's outfitters, a pair of black walking shoes, a pair of socks, and a set of underwear. In each case he bought only what had the Danish maker's name on a small cloth tab inside. His last purchase was a book in Danish on the notable churches and cathedrals of France. He stayed overnight in Copenhagen and caught the 3:15 plane to Brussels on the following day. Why a man of the undoubted talents of Paul Goosen should have gone wrong in middle age was something of a mystery. During his 30 years as a trusted employee of the Fabrique Nationale at Liège, he had established a reputation for unfailing precision in a branch of engineering where precision is absolutely indispensable, and had become the company's foremost expert in the wide range of weapons which that organization produces. By the time in the early 50s that a large sum of money had been embezzled from a foreign customer in the course of a lucrative arms deal, and suspicion had fallen upon him, he was a departmental chief in the firm, and his own superiors had been loudest in informing the police that their suspicions with regard to the trusted Mr. Goosens were ridiculous. But the presiding judge took the view that to betray a position of trust in such a manner was all the more reprehensible, and he had been given 10 years in prison. His wife had divorced him, and the old life of the suburban dweller in a neat, flower-trimmed, detached house in one of the prettier outskirts of Liège was over. So was his career with FN. He had taken a small flat in Brussels, later a house further out of town as his fortunes prospered from his thriving business as the source of illegal arms to half the underworld in Western Europe. By the early 60s, he had gained the nickname L'Armurier, the armourer. He felt no qualms as he waited on the morning of the 21st of July, 1963, for the arrival of an Englishman who had been guaranteed to him over the phone by one of his best customers, a former mercenary in the service of Katanga. The visitor turned up at noon, and Goosen showed him into his little office off the hall. The man whose passport announced him as Alexander Duggan removed his dark glasses and stared quizzically at the little gunsmith as 2 beers were poured. Goosen seated himself behind his desk and asked quietly, "In what way may I be of service to you, monsieur?" "I believe Louis rang you earlier about my coming?" "Certainly," Goosen nodded. "Otherwise you would not be here." "Well, since I know what your business is, there's little reason why you should not know mine. I specialize in the removal of men who have powerful and wealthy enemies. Evidently, such men are usually powerful and wealthy themselves and can afford specialist protection. Such a job needs planning and the right weapon. I have such a job on hand at the moment. I shall need a rifle." Goosen nodded benignly. "Excellent, excellent. A specialist like myself. I think I sense a challenge. What kind of rifle had you in mind?" "It's not so much the type of rifle that's important. It's more a question of the limitations that are imposed by the job, and of finding a rifle which will perform satisfactorily under those limitations." "A one-off," Goosen purred delightedly. "A gun that will be tailor-made for one man and one job under one set of circumstances, never to be repeated. You have come to the right man. Now tell me, what are these limitations?" "The main limitation is in the physical bulk of the working parts. Chamber and breech must be no bulkier than this." The Englishman held up his right hand, the tip of the middle finger touching the end of the thumb in the form of a letter O, less than 2½ inches in diameter. "Now that seems to mean it cannot be a repeater, since a gas chamber would be larger than that, nor can it have a bulky spring mechanism for the same reason. It seems to me it must be a bolt-action rifle, but the bolt must not stick out sideways. It must slide straight back towards the shoulder for the fitting of the bullet into the breech. Also, there must be no trigger guard, and the trigger itself must be detachable, so that it can be fitted just before firing." "Why?" asked the Belgian. "Because the whole mechanism must pass into a tubular compartment for storage and carry, and the compartment must not attract attention. The gun need not be of heavy caliber. The bullet will do the work. It must have a short barrel, probably not longer than 12 inches. Over what range will you have to fire?" "This is still not certain, but probably not more than 130 meters. For firing, the weapon must have a frame stock like a Sten gun, each of the 3 sections of which, upper and lower members and the shoulder rest, must unscrew into 3 separate rods. Lastly, there must be a completely effective silencer and a telescopic sight. Both of these too must be removable for storage and carry." "It is a very complex order," said Goosen. "Really, what you have described is a hunting expedition in which the equipment must be carried past certain checks in such a manner as to arouse no suspicion. A hunting expedition supposes a hunting rifle, and that is what you shall have. I think I have such a gun in mind, and easily available here in Brussels. An expensive, high-precision gun, very accurate, beautifully tooled, and yet light and slim, used a lot for chamois and other small deer. But with explosive bullets, just the thing for bigger game. Tell me, will the, gentleman be moving slowly, fast, or not at all?" "Stationary." "No problems then. The fitting of a frame stock of 3 separate steel rods and the screw-in trigger is mere mechanics. The tapping of the end of the barrel for silencer and the shortening of the barrel by 8 inches I can do myself. Now, monsieur, you mentioned earlier a tubular compartment for carrying the gun in its broken-down form. What had you in mind?" The Englishman slipped his hand inside his jacket and produced a silver propelling pencil. He spun round Goosen's notepad and sketched rapidly for a few seconds. "You recognize that?" he asked, turning the pad back to the gunsmith. "Of course," replied the Belgian. "The whole thing is composed of a series of hollow aluminium tubes which screw together. This one," tapping with the point of the pencil at a place on the diagram, contains one of the struts of the rifle stock. This here contains the other strut. Both are concealed within the tubes that make up this section. The shoulder rest of the rifle is this here, in its entirety. This is therefore the only part which doubles up with two purposes without changing in any way. Here, at the thickest point, is the largest diameter tube which contains the breech of the rifle with the bolt inside it. Obviously, with a telescopic sight, there need be no foresight, so the whole thing slides out of this compartment when the assemblage is unscrewed. The last two sections, here and here, contain the telescopic sight itself and the silencer. The bullets are contained in this little stump at the bottom. When the whole thing is assembled, it must pass for precisely what it looks. When unscrewed, its 7 component parts can be extracted for reassembly as a fully operational rifle. For a few seconds, the little Belgian looked at the diagram. Then he rose slowly and held out his hand. "Monsieur," he said with reverence, "it is a conception of genius, undetectable, and yet so simple. It shall be done." "Good. Now I shall need the gun in about 14 days. Can that be arranged?" "Yes. I can acquire the gun within 3 days, and a week's work should see the modifications achieved." "Now for the question of your expenses and fee," said the Englishman. "Have you an idea of how much they will be?" The Belgian thought for a while. "For this kind of job, with all the work it entails," he said, "I must ask a fee of 1,000 English pounds. I concede that is above the rate, but this is not a simple rifle. I believe I am the only man in Europe capable of doing it justice, of making a perfect job of it." The Englishman reached into his breast pocket and extracted a bundle of £5 notes. He counted out 5 wads of 20 notes each. "I would suggest," he said, "that I make you a down payment of £500. I shall bring the remaining 500 on my return." "Monsieur," said the Belgian, "it is a pleasure to do business with a professional and a gentleman." "There is a little more," went on his visitor evenly. "You will make no attempt further to contact Louis, nor to ask him or anyone else who I am, nor what is my true identity. Nor will you seek to inquire for whom I am working. In the event that you should try to do so, it is certain I shall hear about the inquiries. In that eventuality, you will die. Is that understood?" Goossens had faced many of the tough men of the Belgian underworld when they came to him to ask for special or unusual weapons, but there was something distant and implacable about the visitor from across the Channel who intended to kill an important and well-protected figure. "Monsieur," he said quietly, "it is of more importance to me that nothing you do should ever be traced back to me than that I should seek to know more than I do about you. Bonjour, monsieur." After leaving Goossens, the Jackal found a cruising taxi to take him back to the city centre. He suspected that in order to acquire guns, Goossens would have to have a forger in his employ somewhere, but he preferred to find and use one of his own. Again, Louis, his contact from the old days in Katanga, helped him. The Jackal found his man in a bar off the Rue Neuve, after Louis had arranged the appointment. He introduced himself, and the pair retired to a corner alcove. The Jackal produced his driving license, which was in his own name, and said, "This belonged to a man now dead. As I'm banned from driving in Britain, I need a new front page in my own name." He put the passport in the name of Duggan in front of the forger. The man opposite glanced at the passport first, took in the fact that it had been issued only a few days ago, and glanced shrewdly at the Englishman. Then he looked at the driving license and studied it closely for a moment. Glancing up, he said, "Difficult, monsieur. This paper." He flicked the small sheet gummed onto the first page of the license. "Could be printed by a child's printing set. The watermark is easy. Was that all you wanted? No, there are 2 other papers. The Jackal described them to the last detail. The Belgian's eyes narrowed in thought. That is not so easy, he said. The French identity card, not too bad. One must work from an original to achieve the best results, but there are plenty about. But the other one, I do not think I have seen such a one. It is a most unusual requirement, and the photograph will not be easy. You say there must be a difference in age, in hair coloring and length. Most of those wishing for a false document intend that their own photograph shall be on the document, but with the personal details falsified. But to devise a new photograph which does not even look like you as you now appear, this complicates things. Belgian thought again for a while, staring at the photograph in the passport in front of him. All right, he said eventually. It can be done. How much? Said the Englishman. 20,000 Belgian francs. Jackal thought for a moment. About £150 sterling. All right. I'll pay you £100 deposit, and the remainder on delivery. The Belgian rose. Then we had better get the portrait photos taken. I have my own studio. They took a taxi to a small basement flat more than a mile away. The Belgian led the way down the steps to the front door, unlocked it, and ushered his guest inside. A large trunk in one corner, which he unlocked carefully, revealed a selection of expensive cameras and flash equipment, besides a host of facial props, including hair tints and dyes, toupees, wigs, spectacles, and a case of theatrical cosmetics. Studying the effect of 30 minutes working on the Jackal's face with makeup, he suddenly dived into the chest and produced a wig, colored iron grey and cut en brosse. Do you think that your own hair cut to this length and tinted this color could look like this? He asked. The Jackal took the wig and examined it. Yes, I think so, he said. The Belgian helped the Jackal to fit the wig properly, and then took several photographs of his customer in his new disguise. Half an hour later, he came out of the developing room with a sheaf of prints in his hands. Staring up from the photographs was the face of an old and tired man. The skin was ashen grey, and there were dark rings of fatigue beneath the eyes. The man wore neither beard nor moustache, but the grey hair on his head gave the impression he must have been in his 50s at least, and not a robust 50 at that. I think it would work, said the Belgian with a smile. In the photograph here, we have you in open-necked striped shirt with collar attached. Try to avoid that shirt, or even an open-neck shirt at all. Wear a tie or a scarf. The main point, of course, is the hair. It must be cut en brosse before this photo is presented, and tinted grey, perhaps even greyer than in the photograph, but not less so. To increase the impression of age and decrepitude, grow 2 or 3 days of beard stubble. Then shave with a cutthroat razor, but badly, nicking yourself in a couple of places. Elderly men tend to do this. As for the complexion, this is vital. To extract pity, it must be grey and tired, rather waxy and ill-looking. Can you get hold of some pieces of cordite? It might be arranged, said the Englishman cautiously. 2 or 3 small pieces of cordite, chewed and swallowed, produced within half an hour a feeling of nausea, uncomfortable but not disastrous. They also turn the skin a grey pallor and cause facial sweating. Thank you for the information, said the Jackal. Now, for the rest. Do you think you can produce the documents in time? From the technical standpoint, there is no doubt of it. The only remaining problem is to acquire an original of the second French document. But if you come back in the first few days of August, I think I can have them all ready for you. You, mentioned a down payment to cover expenses. The Jackal reached into his inside pocket and produced a single bundle of 20 £5 notes, which he handed the Belgian. "There are certain things which I wish to make clear," he said quietly, and the friendliness was gone from his voice. "When you have finished the job, you will return to me the new license and the page removed from the one you now have. Also, the negatives and all prints of the photographs you have just taken. The name on the 2 French documents you are going to produce you may select yourself, providing it is a simple and common French name. You will never speak to anyone of this commission again. In the event that you infringe any of these conditions, you will die. Is that understood?" The Belgian stared back for a few moments. "It is understood, monsieur," he said. A few moments later, the Englishman was gone into the night. The following morning, he checked out of his hotel and took the Brabant Express to Paris. Colonel Roland, the head of the French Secret Service, sat at his desk on the same morning and surveyed the 2 routine reports before him. The first was an interdepartmental memo from the permanent office in Rome to the effect that Rodin, Montclair, and Casson were still holed up in their top-floor suite. Instructions from Paris remained unchanged, not to make any approach, but simply to keep watch. The men in the hotel had established a routine for keeping in touch with the outside world. Each day, one of the guards left the hotel and walked to the head post office of Rome. Here, a post-restaurant pigeonhole was reserved in the name of one Poitiers. All mail for the top men of the OAS was addressed to Poitiers, and each day the mail arriving overnight was handed to the guard, who had been identified as one Victor Kowalski, formerly a corporal of the Foreign Legion and a member of Rodin's original company in Indochina. If Kowalski had letters to post, he waited by the post box inside the main hall of the building until 5 minutes before collection time, dropped the mail through the slit, then waited until the entire boxful was collected and taken back into the building for sorting. Attempts to interfere with the process of either collection or dispatch of this mail would entail a degree of violence which had already been precluded by Paris. Occasionally, Kowalski made a telephone call, long distance, from the overseas calls telephone counter, but here again, attempts either to learn the number asked for or overhear the conversation had failed. Colonel Roland took up the second report. It was a police memorandum from Metz, stating that a man had been questioned during a routine raid on a bar and had half killed 2 policemen in the ensuing fight. Later, at the police station, he had been identified by his fingerprints as a deserter from the Foreign Legion by the name of Kovacs, Hungarian by birth, and a notorious OAS thug, long wanted for his connection with a series of terror murders of loyalist notables in Algeria during 1961. At that time, he had operated as partner of another OAS gunman still at large, former Foreign Legion Corporal Victor Kowalski. Roland pondered the connection between the 2 men, and at last he pressed a buzzer in front of him and said, "Get me the personal file on Victor Kowalski." He had the file up from archives in 10 minutes, and spent another hour reading it. Several times he ran his eye over one particular paragraph. Just before noon, he convened a small meeting consisting of himself, his personal secretary, and a specialist in handwriting from the documentation department. "Gentlemen," he told them, "with the unwilling but inevitable assistance of one not here present, we are going to compose, write, and dispatch a letter." The Jackal's first few days in Paris were spent in the pursuits of the tourist. On his first day, he brought a street map of the city and marked off the places of interest he most wanted to see. These he visited and studied with remarkable devotion, even bearing in mind their architectural beauty and historical associations. He spent 3 days roaming around the Arc de Triomphe and sitting on the terrace of the Café de l'Élysée, scanning the monument and the rooftops of the great buildings that surround the Place de l'Étoile. He also visited the Place des Invalides and the precincts of Notre Dame Cathedral. His last visit was to the square at the southern end of the Rue de Rennes. He looked round at the tall, narrow-fronted buildings on each side of the end of this street that also overlooked the square itself. Slowly, he wended his way round the square to the southern side and peered through the railings into the courtyard of the Gare Montparnasse. He turned with his back to the station railings and looked down the traffic artery of the Rue de Rennes. He was suddenly convinced that this was the place the President of France would come to, one last time, on the appointed day. The other places he had examined during the past week were possibles. This one, he felt sure, was the certainty. And the distance from the top floor of the corner house on the western side of the Rue de Rennes and the center of the station forecourt was about 130 meters. He spent the next day studying this house from a café terrace on the opposite side of the street. The concierge, a comfortable, grandmotherly soul, sat in the doorway knitting. Shortly before 4, she bundled up her knitting and shuffled off down the road to the bakery. The Jackal rose quietly from his bench and entered the apartment block. He chose the stairs rather than the lift, and ran silently upwards. At the top floor, he opened the rear door and looked down. The fire escape led to an inner courtyard, around which were the rear entrances to the other blocks that made up the corner of the square behind him. On the far side of the courtyard, the hollow square of buildings was penetrated by a narrow covered alleyway leading towards the north. The Jackal closed the door quietly and replaced the safety bar. There were 2 doors in the passage giving access to flats overlooking the inner courtyard, and 2 others for flats on the front of the building. His sense of direction told him either of these front flats contained windows looking down into the Rue de Rennes, or half sideways onto the square, and beyond it, the forecourt of the station. These were the windows he had been observing from the street below. He would need keys on the appointed day, he realized. The concierge would certainly have one for each flat, somewhere in her little loge. A few minutes later, he was running lightly down the stairs the way he had come. He turned left up the Rue de Rennes, past 2 other blocks of apartments and a post office. At the corner of the block was a narrow street, the Rue Litre. He turned into it, following the wall of the post office. Where the building ended, there was a narrow, covered alleyway. The Jackal stopped to light a cigarette, and while the flame flickered, glanced sideways down the alley. At the end of the tunnel was a sunlit courtyard. On the far side, he could make out the last rungs of the fire escape of the building he had just left. He had found his escape route. On the last day of July, the Jackal spent the morning at the flea market. He bought a pair of well-scuffed shoes, some not-too-clean trousers, and a long military greatcoat. He would have preferred one of lighter material, but it was long enough, even on him, stretching to well below the knee, which was the important thing. As he was on his way out, his eye was caught by a stall full of medals, mostly stained with age. He bought a collection, together with a booklet describing French military medals and captions telling the reader for which campaigns or for what kinds of acts of gallantry the various medals were awarded. After lunching lightly, he slipped round the corner to his hotel, paid his bill, and packed. He caught the Étoile du Nord express for Brussels, leaving the Gare du Nord at 5:15, and arrived in the Belgian capital in the last hours of July. The letter for Victor Kowalski arrived in Rome the following morning. He was crossing the foyer of the hotel on his return from picking up the mail from the post office when one of the bellhops called after him, "Signore, per favore." The dark-eyed young man held a letter in his hand as he came to Kowalski's side. "Una lettera, signore, per un signor Kowalski. Non conosco questo signore." Kowalski did not understand a word of the babble of Italian, but he got the sense, and he recognized his own name, badly pronounced though it was. He snatched the letter from the man's hand and stared at the scrawled name and address. He was registered at the hotel under another name, and not being a reading man, had failed to notice that 5 days earlier a Paris newspaper had had a scoop announcing that 3 of the top men of the OAS were now holed up on the top floor of the hotel. He dimly understood from the Italian that none of the desk staff had heard of a guest named Kowalski, and did not know what to do with the letter. Bon, je vais demander," he said, pointing upwards through the ceiling. The Italian saw the light. "Ah, sì, domandare. Prego, signore. Tante grazie." Taking the lift to the 8th floor, Kowalski emerged to find himself confronted by the desk duty man in the corridor, who telephoned upstairs to announce his arrival, then signaled to him to go up. After delivering the mail to Colonel Rodin, Kowalski returned to his room and sat down to read his letter, which he had said nothing about to Rodin. He started with the signature, and was surprised that it should be from Kovacs, whom he had not seen for a year, and who hardly knew how to write. Kovacs began by saying he had seen a newspaper story saying that Rodin, Montclair, and Casson were hiding at that hotel in Rome. He had supposed his old mate Kowalski would be with them, hence writing on the off chance of reaching him. The last paragraph recounted that he had met Jojo some weeks before, and Jojo had said that little Sylvie was sick with Luke something. Anyway, it was to do with her blood having gone wrong, but that he, Kovacs, hoped she would soon be all right, and Victor should not worry. But Victor did worry. It worried him badly to think that little Sylvie was ill. He had been 12 years old when the Germans invaded Poland, and 1 year older when his parents were taken away in a dark van. He had killed his first German at 15. He was 17 when the Russians came, and he went westwards, like a hunted animal, towards Czechoslovakia. Later, it was Austria and a displaced persons camp. He broke out one spring night in 1946 and hitched south towards Italy, and thence into France, in company with another Pole who spoke French. In Marseille, he broke into a shop one night, killed the proprietor who disturbed him, and was on the run again. His companion left him, advising Victor there was only one place to go, the Foreign Legion. He signed on the next morning, and was in Sidi Bel Abbes before the police investigation in war-torn Marseille was really off the ground. After 6 years in Indochina, he was sent to Algeria. But in between, he had a posting to a weapons training course for 6 months, outside Marseille. There he met Julie, a tiny but vicious scrubber in a dockside bar. Julie liked the enormous legionnaire, and for several months he became her protector by night, escorting her home after work to the sleazy attic in the Vieux Port. There was a lot of lust, particularly on her side, but no love between them, and even less when she discovered she was pregnant. Kowalski had become friendly with another Polish ex-legionnaire, Józef Grzybowski, known as Jojo the Pole, who had been invalided out of Indochina and had settled with a jolly widow running a snack stall at the main station in Marseille. It was to Jojo that Kowalski had turned for advice about the baby. Somewhere in the small hours of the morning, very drunk, they agreed on their plan and drank to it with the solemnity of the truly intoxicated. The next morning, Jojo remembered his pledge, but could not think how to break the news to his wife. It took him 3 days. He skated warily round the subject once or twice, then blurted it out while he and the missus were in bed. To his amazement, Madame was delighted, and so it was arranged. In due course, Victor returned to Algeria to rejoin Major Rodin, who now commanded the battalion. Julie was brought to bed in late 1955 and produced a girl, blue-eyed and golden-haired. Adoption papers were duly filed by Jojo and his wife with the concurrence of Julie. The adoption went through, Julie went back to her old life, and the Jojos had themselves a daughter, whom they named Sylvie. They informed Victor by letter, and in his barracks bed, he was strangely pleased. 3 years later, before a long combat mission in the Algerian hills, the chaplain had proposed to him that he might like to make a will. The idea had never even occurred to him before, but with considerable assistance he made one, leaving all his worldly goods and chattels to the daughter of one Joseph Przybowski, former legionnaire, presently of Marseille. Eventually a copy of this document, along with the rest of his dossier, was filed with the archives of the Ministry of the Armed Forces in Paris. When Kowalski's name became known to the French security forces in connection with the terrorist activities in 1961, this dossier was unearthed along with many others and came to the attention of Colonel Roland. A visit was paid to the Przybowskis and the story came out. But Kowalski never learned this. And now Sylvie was sick with Luke something. Kowalski worried a lot throughout the rest of the morning. After lunch, he went upstairs to have the steel case for the mail chained to his wrist. As Rodin was turning the key in the lock, Kowalski suddenly asked, "Colonel, what is Luke something?" Rodin looked up in surprise. "I've never heard of him," he replied. "It's a malady of the blood," explained Kowalski. Casson laughed. "Leukemia, you mean," he said. "It's cancer. Cancer of the blood." "They can cure it?" asked Kowalski. "No, it's fatal. There's no cure." "Why?" "Nothing," mumbled Kowalski. "Just something I read." Then he left. During the first week of August, the Jackal paid 2 visits in Brussels, one to Goossens, where he picked up the gun he had ordered, together with the silencer, telescopic sight, bullets, and special accessories, and the other to the Belgian forger, from whom he received his new driving license now bearing the name of Alexander Duggan, and a French carte d'identité and veteran's card in the name of André Martin, age 53, born at Colmar and resident in Paris. His own photograph, aged by 20 years, with iron-grey hair cut en brosse, stared out of a tiny corner of the cards. While the Jackal was doing his shopping in Brussels, Victor Kowalski was wrestling with the intricacies of international telephone inquiries from Rome's main post office. Not speaking Italian, he had sought the aid of the counter-clerks, and eventually one of them agreed that he spoke a little French. Laboriously, Kowalski explained that he wished to telephone a man named Przybowski in Marseille, France. It took half an hour for the connection to be made. At the other end of the line, Jojo's voice was distorted by crackling, and he seemed hesitant to confirm the bad news in Kovac's letter. Unfortunately, yes, it was true about the illness of little Sylvie. She had been getting weaker and thinner, and when finally a doctor had diagnosed the illness, it had already been time to put her to bed. "How long did the quacks give her?" Kowalski roared down the line. "It could be a week, maybe 2 or 3, said Jojo. 'It could be a week, maybe 2 or 3, said Jojo. 'It could be a week, maybe 2 or 3, said Jojo. 'It could be a week, maybe 2 or 3, said Jojo. 'It could be a week, maybe 2 or 3, said Jojo. 'It could be a week, maybe 2 or 3, said Jojo. 'It could be a week, maybe 2 or 3, said Jojo. 'It could be a week, maybe 2 or 3, said Jojo. 'It could be a week, maybe 2 or 3, said Jojo. 'It could be a week, maybe 2 or 3, said Jojo. 'It could be a week, maybe 2 or 3, said Jojo. 'It could be a week, maybe 2 or 3, said Jojo. 'It could be a week, maybe 2 or 3, said Jojo. 'It could be a week, maybe 2 or 3, said Jojo. 'It could be Disbelievingly, Kowalski stared at the mouthpiece in his hand. Without a word, he replaced it on the cradle and blundered out of the cabin. In his flat in Marseille, Jojo also put down the receiver when he realized Kowalski had hung up. He turned to find the two men from the Secret Service still where they had been, each with his Colt 45 police special in his hand. One was trained on Jojo, the other on his wife, who sat ashen-faced in the corner of the sofa. "Is he coming?" asked one of the men. "He didn't say. He just hung up on me," said the Pole. "He had better come, for your sake, Jojo," said the Secret Service man. It habitually took Kowalski a long time to make up his mind on anything where no orders from above were available to help him, nor standing orders to decide on his behalf. But by Monday morning, he had come to his decision. He would not be gone long, perhaps just a day, or maybe 2 days, if the planes did not connect properly. In any event, it was something that had to be done. He would explain to the colonel afterwards. He was sure that he would understand. From the observation terrace at Rome's Fiumicino airport, the two agents watched Kowalski climb the steps into the plane. As the turboprop took off for Marseille, the two men left the rail. On the way through the main hall, they stopped at a public kiosk, while one of them dialed a local Rome number. He identified himself to the person at the other end and said, slowly, "He's gone. Alitalia 4501. Landing Marignan 1210. Ciao." 10 minutes later, the message was in Paris. 10 minutes after that, it was in Marseille. Kowalski watched the taxi turn back into town until it was out of sight. He found the apartment block where his friend Jojo lived and took the steps at a run. Flat 23 was on the second floor. He pressed the bell. The door in front of him opened, and the lunging pickaxe handle swung out of the gap and down towards his forehead. On each side of the pole, the doors of flats 22 and 24 opened inwards, and men surged out. It all happened in less than half a second. 12 hours later, after a fast drive the length of France, Kowalski was lying in a cell beneath a fortress barracks outside Paris. The Pole lay face up on a narrow iron cot whose legs were embedded in the concrete floor. 2 heavy leather straps secured his ankles, 2 more his thighs and wrists. He was still unconscious, breathing deeply and irregularly. He opened his eyes 3 days later on the 10th of August, and the same day had his first and only session with the interrogators. The Jackal spent the 3 days after his return from Brussels putting the final touches to his preparations for his forthcoming mission into France. With his new driving license in the name of Alexander Duggan in his pocket, he went down to the headquarters of the Automobile Association and acquired an international driving license in the same name. With this task finished, he settled down to wait for the 2 pieces of paper that would set him on his way. The first letter arrived on the morning of the 9th of August. It was an envelope postmarked in Rome and bore the message, "Your friend can be contacted at Molitor 5901. Introduce yourself with the words, Ici Jackal. Reply will be, Ici Valmy. Good luck." It was not until the morning of the 11th that the letter from Zurich arrived. He grinned openly as he read the confirmation that come what may, provided he remained alive, he was a wealthy man for the rest of his life. Kowalski's confession reached Colonel Roland in his office at 1 in the morning. The first time, He read the 26 pages of the dossier quickly, trying to grasp the gist of what the Legionnaire had been saying. The 3 OAS leaders were in Rome. Well, he knew that anyway. But why? This question had been asked 8 times. By and large, the answer had been the same each time. They did not wish to be kidnapped. There was one word the Legionnaire had mentioned twice in answering these 8 identical questions. The word was secret. As an adjective, there was nothing secret about their presence in Rome. Or as a noun, what secret? It all seemed to have stemmed from Vienna. They had had a meeting in Vienna, and they went to Rome and took refuge against the possibility of being kidnapped and interrogated until they revealed a secret. There were pieces missing. Were they really missing? Gone for all time, since the message by phone at 3 in the morning had told him Kowalski would never be questioned again because he was dead? Or were they hidden somewhere in the jumbled text? There were several references to a foreigner over whom Kowalski seemed to have mixed feelings. Sometimes he used the word bon, meaning good, to refer to this man. At other times, he called him a fâcheur, an annoying or irritating type. Shortly after 5 a.m., Colonel Roland sent for the tape and spent the next hour listening to the recording of Kowalski's interrogation. When he finally switched off the machine, he swore quietly and violently to himself. Taking a fine pen, he made several alterations to the transcribed text. Kowalski had not referred to the foreigner as bon, but as blonde, and the word that had been written down as fâcheur had in reality been faucheur, meaning a killer. From then on, the task of piecing together Kowalski's hazy meaning was easy. The word for jackal, which he had thought was Kowalski's way of insulting the men who were interrogating him, took on a new meaning. It became the code name of the killer with the blonde hair, who was a foreigner, and whom the 3 OAS chiefs had met in Vienna. Roland could work out for himself now the reason for the wave of bank and jewel robberies that had rocked France over the preceding 8 weeks. The blonde, whoever he was, wanted money to do a job for the OAS, and there was only one job in the world that could command that kind of money. At 7 in the morning, Roland sat down to write a report, which had only one listed recipient, and was headed, "For your eyes only." "So that is where we stand, gentlemen," said the Minister of the Interior. He surveyed the meeting seated round the table of the conference room to let the impact of his words sink in. "You have all read the summary of the report by Colonel Roland, which lies in front of you," he continued, "and you have heard from me the considerable limitations which the President has felt obliged to impose on our efforts to avert this threat to his person. The President feels that if the secret were out, the press would have a field day, the foreign nations would jeer, and any extra security precautions taken by us would be interpreted both here and abroad as the spectacle of the President of France hiding from a single man, a foreigner at that. I will stress again, there must be absolute secrecy in the conduct of this investigation. Needless to say, you are all sworn to total silence, and will discuss the matter with no one outside this room. I have called you all here because it seems to me that whatever we are to do, the resources of all the departments here represented must sooner or later be called upon, and you, the departmental chiefs, should have no doubt as to the top priority that this affair demands. Colonel Roland, have you had any success with your inquiries in Vienna that might help us to establish the identity of the Jackal?" Colonel Roland shook his head. "I'm afraid not, Minister," he said. There are only 4 men in the world who know the identity of this Jackal. One is the man himself, and the other 3 are in a hotel in Rome. How about trying to get one of them back here? The minister shook his head. Kidnappings are out, he said. The Italian government would go out of its mind if that kind of thing happened a few yards from the Via Condotti. Besides, the extent and quality of the protective screen Rodin and his 2 henchmen have built around themselves rules this out from the practical standpoint also. It would involve a major gun battle to get one of them out alive. Well, one thing is clear. This Jackal must be found, said Colonel St. Clair, an Air Force colonel on the Élysée staff. Several of the others round the table glanced at each other, and an eyebrow or 2 was raised. St. Clair was a fanatical Gaullist, but renowned in the entourage of the president as being equally fanatical concerning his own ambition. That much certainly is clear, murmured the minister. What we are trying to devise is a way in which that can be done, within the limits imposed upon us, and which of the departments here represented would be best suited for the job. The protection of the President of the Republic, announced St. Clair grandiosely, must depend in the last resort on the Presidential Security Corps and the President's personal staff. We, I can assure you, Minister, will do our duty. The Minister of the Interior raised his eyes to meet those of the Élysée Palace courtier, and demonstrated why he was a minister. The Colonel St. Clair is perfectly right, of course, he purred. We shall all do our duty. And I am sure it has occurred to the Colonel that, should a certain department undertake the responsibility for the destruction of this plot and fail to achieve it, a certain disapprobation would inevitably descend upon the head of him who failed. St. Clair's thin face tightened perceptibly, and the worry showed in his eyes. What do you think, Bouvier? The minister went on. You have not spoken yet. The head of the Brigade Criminelle eased the pipe out of his mouth and said, It seems to me, Minister, that the Secret Service cannot disclose this man through their agents in the OAS, since not even the OAS know who he is. The DST cannot pick him up at the border, for they don't know whom to intercept. The RG can give us no documentary information about him because they do not know what documents to search for. And the police cannot arrest him, or they do not know whom to arrest. Therefore, the first task is to give this man a name. With a name, we get a face. With a face, a passport. With a passport, an arrest. But to find the name, and do it in secret, is a job for pure detective work. And who, commissaire, is the best detective in France? Asked the minister quietly. The best detective in France, monsieur, is my own deputy, Commissaire Claude Lebel, said Bouvier. Summon him, said the minister. An hour later, Claude Lebel emerged from the conference room dazed and bewildered. For 50 minutes, he had listened as the minister had briefed him on the task that lay ahead. He would set up his own office. He would have unlimited access to all necessary information. The entire resources of the organizations headed by the men seated round the table would be at his disposal. There were to be no limits to the costs incurred. While he listened, his heart sank. They were asking the impossible. There was no crime, no clues, no witnesses, except 3 whom he could not talk to. Just a name, a code name, and the whole world to search it. His only request had been that he be allowed to seek the cooperation in confidence of the heads of some of the criminal investigation forces of the major countries likely to have the identity of a professional assassin like the Jackal on their files. Without such cooperation, he pointed out, it would be impossible even to start looking. He knew personally the men he needed to contact. His inquiries would not be official, but would be along the personal contact basis that exists between most of the Western world's top policemen. After some reflection, the minister had granted the request. Now he stood in the hall waiting for Bouvier, and as the last man filed out of the conference room, the head of the Brigade Criminelle clapped a ham-like hand on his shoulder. Eh bien, mon petit Claude, you'll have to drop whatever you're doing. Clear the desk completely. Is there anyone you want to help you? Yes. Caron, said Lebel, referring to one of the younger inspectors who had worked with him in homicide. Okay, you have Caron. Anyone else? No, thank you. But Caron will have to know. Bouvier thought for a few moments. It should be all right. They can't expect miracles. Oh, and there's one last thing. Before I left the meeting, the minister suggested that the whole group who were there tonight be kept informed at regular intervals of progress and developments. I tried to head it off, but I lost. There's to be a briefing by you every evening at the ministry, from now on. 10 o'clock sharp. Colonel St. Clair arrived home just before midnight. He had spent the previous 3 hours meticulously typing his report on the evening's meeting in the Interior Ministry, which would be on the desk of the Secretary-General of the Elysée first thing in the morning. With luck, the report would be on the President's desk an hour afterwards, and this would do him no harm. He had used extra care in selecting just the right phraseology to give a slight hint of the writer's disapproval of putting a matter so important as the security of the head of state into the sole hands of a commissaire of police, a man more accustomed to uncovering petty criminals of little brains or talent. Privately, he did not put the assassin's chance very high. The presidential security screen was the most efficient in the world, and he had few qualms that it could be penetrated by some foreign gun. He let himself in by the front door of his flat, and heard his newly installed mistress call him from the bedroom. "Is that you, darling?" "Yes, chérie. Of course it's me." She came running through from the bedroom, dressed in a filmy black baby doll nightie, threw her bare arms round his neck, and gave him a kiss. Jacqueline Dumas had been a member of the OAS since 1961. She hated St. Clair as much as on the first day they had met, but she had learned that what he lacked in virility, he could be made to make up in loquacity, particularly about his importance in the scheme of things at the Elysée Palace. "What kept you so long?" she asked. "I've been waiting for ages." St. Clair shook his head somberly. "Certainly nothing that you should bother your head with, my dear." "Oh, you're mean," she said in a mock sulk. "You just don't give me any explanation. I can't ring you at the office. I've been worrying for hours that something might have happened to you. You've never been this late before without ringing me." "Look, darling, I've been very busy. There was something of a crisis, something I had to sort out before I could get away. I'd have rung, but there were people still working, popping in and out of the office the whole time. Several of them know my wife is away. It would have seemed odd for me to ring home through the switchboard. It seems the OAS are still after the president. The plot was discovered this afternoon. That's what's kept me." "Oh, don't be silly, darling. They were finished long ago." "They're bloody well not. Now they've hired a foreign assassin to try to kill him." Half an hour later, Colonel St. Clair lay asleep, face half buried in the pillow, snoring gently. Beside him, his mistress lay staring up through the darkness at the ceiling. What she had learned had left her aghast. Although she had had no previous knowledge of any plot, she could work out for herself the importance of Kowalski's confession. She waited in silence until the bedside clock registered 2 in the morning. Easing herself out of the bed, she slid the plug of the bedroom telephone extension out of its socket. The colonel was still snoring. Outside the bedroom, she quietly closed the door, crossed the sitting room towards the hall, and closed that door after her. From the phone on the hall table, she dialed a Molitor number. There was a wait of several minutes until a sleepy voice answered. She spoke rapidly for 2 minutes, received an acknowledgement, and hung up. A minute later, she was back in bed, trying to get to sleep. In a small and fusty bachelor flat, while Paris slept towards the dawn, a middle-aged schoolmaster placed a call to a Rome number and spent an anxious 20 minutes waiting until it came through. "I wish to speak to Poitiers," he told the Italian voice that answered. There was a series of clicks. Then a tired voice answered in French. "This is Valmy," said the man in Paris urgently. "Kowalski was taken. The Jackal is blown. Repeat, the Jackal is blown." Rodin swore silently and intensely for several seconds. Kowalski had, for some inexplicable reason, returned to France, been picked up, and had talked. The important thing now was to try to recollect just what Kowalski had to tell. There had been no names mentioned at the meeting, but Valmy's message mentioned the Jackal by his code name. How could Kowalski have told them that? With a start of horror, Rodin recalled the scene as they had parted. He had stood in the doorway with the Englishman. Kowalski had been a few feet down the corridor. What had he, Rodin, said? "Bonsoir, Monsieur Jackal." Of course, damn and blast it. Rodin realized that Kowalski could never have got the killer's real name. Only he, Montclair, and Casson knew that. All the same, Valmy was right. With Kowalski's confession in the hands of the Secret Service, it was too far blown to be retrievable. They had the meeting, the hotel, the code name. There could be no doubt they would guess what Kowalski had guessed. The blonde was the killer. From then on, the net around de Gaulle would tighten. He would abandon all public engagements, all exits from his palace, all chances for an assassin to get it. The operation was blown. He would have to call off the Jackal. He summoned the bodyguard to whom, since the departure of Kowalski, he had given the duties of going every day to the post office to collect the mail, and briefed him at length. By 9 o'clock, the bodyguard was in the post office and asking for a telephone number in London. It took 20 minutes before the telephone at the other end began to ring. The switchboard operator gestured the Frenchman to a cabin to take the call. He picked up the receiver and listened to the distant buzz of an English telephone ringing. The Jackal rose early that morning, but he had much to do. He drank his habitual 2 cups of coffee, washed, showered, and shaved. At 9:15, he took his luggage, 2 pieces in each hand, closed the self-locking flat door behind him, and went downstairs. It was a short walk to South Audley Street, and he caught a taxi on the corner. "London Airport, number 2 building," he told the driver. As the taxi moved away, the phone in his flat began to ring. It was 10 to 7 when the police car carrying Commissaire Lebel drew up outside the innocent green door in the tiny Rue Paul Valéry, which housed the headquarters of Interpol. For the next 3 hours, Lebel sat hunched over the telephone in the basement communications room, talking to the world's top crime busters. In each telephone conversation, his appeal was much the same. "No, Commissioner, I cannot yet put this request for your assistance on the level of an official inquiry. Certainly I am acting in an official capacity. It is simply that for the moment We are just not sure if even the intent to commit an offense has been formulated or put into the preparation stage. We are looking for a man about whom we know extremely little, not even a name, and only a poor description. Whoever this man may be, he must have one qualification that marks him out. He would have to be one of the world's top professional contract hire assassins, not a gangland trigger, but a political assassin with several successful kills behind him. We would be interested to know if you have anybody like that on your files, even if he has never operated in your own country. LaBelle had no illusions that the heads of the homicide departments of the major police forces of the Western world would fail to understand what he was hinting at, but could not say. There was only one target in France that could interest a first-league political killer. Without exception, the reply was the same. Of course, we'll go through all the files for you. I'll try to get back to you before the day is out. Oh, and Claude, good luck. The Jackal landed at Brussels just after 12. He left his 3 main pieces of luggage in an automatic locker in the main terminal building, and took with him into town only the hand grip, which contained his personal effects, a quantity of plaster of Paris, pads of cotton wool, and bandages. At the main station, he dismissed the taxi and went to the left luggage office. The suitcase containing the gun was still on the shelf where he had seen the clerk deposit it after he had collected it from Goossens. He presented the reclamation slip and was given the case in return. Not far from the station, he found a small and squalid hotel, booked a single room for the night, and took his case up to the room himself. With the door safely locked behind him, he ran a basin of cold water, emptied the plaster and bandages onto the bed, and set to work. It took over 2 hours for the plaster to dry. The suitcase that had formerly contained the gun lay empty. The dismantled gun, each section stored away in its own strong but thin tube, was concealed in the plaster about his leg. When he was finally ready, he slid the case under the bed, checked the room for any last telltale signs, and prepared to leave. At the bottom of the stairs, he was relieved to find that the desk clerk was in the back room behind the desk, where he had been when the Jackal arrived. With a glance at the front door to make sure no one was coming in, the Jackal clutched his hand case to his chest, bent onto all fours, and dragged himself silently across the tiled hall. The front door was open, and he was able to stand upright on the top of the 3 steps that led to the street, out of the line of sight of the desk clerk. He limped painfully down the steps and along the street to the corner where the main road ran past. A taxi spotted him inside half a minute, and he was on his way back to the airport. He presented himself at the Alitalia counter, passport in hand. The girl smiled at him. "I believe you have a ticket for Milan reserved in the name of Duggan," he said. She checked the bookings for the afternoon flight to Milan. It was due to leave in an hour and a half. "Yes, indeed, Mr. Duggan," she beamed at him. The Jackal paid in cash, was issued with his ticket, and told he would be called in an hour. With the aid of a solicitous porter, he withdrew his 3 suitcases from the locker, consigned them to Alitalia, passed through the customs barrier, which, as he was an outgoing traveller, was merely a passport check, and spent the remaining hour enjoying a late lunch in the restaurant. Everybody concerned with the flight was very kind and considerate towards him, because of his leg. He was assisted aboard the coach out to the aircraft, and watched with concern as he made his painful way up the steps to the aircraft's door. The lovely Italian hostess gave him an extra wide smile of welcome, and saw him comfortably seated in one of the group of seats in the center of the aircraft. At 4:15 the airliner was on takeoff, and soon speeding southwards for Milan. The Jackal's plane touched down in Milan shortly after 6. It was at customs that his elaborate preparations in getting the component parts of the gun out of the suitcase and into a less suspicious means of carriage paid dividends. He secured a porter who assembled the 3 main suitcases into a line, and he put his hand grip down beside them. One of the customs officers sauntered across. "Signore, this is all your baggage?" "Yes, these 3 suitcases and this little case." "You have anything to declare?" "No, nothing." "You are on business, signore?" "No, I've come on holiday, but it turns out that it must also include a period of convalescence." "And may I see your passport?" The Jackal handed it over. The Italian examined it closely, then handed it back without a word. "Please, open this one." He gestured at one of the 3 larger suitcases. The Jackal took out his keyring and opened the case. It was the one containing the clothes of the fictitious Danish pastor. The customs officer attached no importance to a dark grey suit, underwear, white shirt, shoes and socks. He did not examine the carefully re-sewn slit in the side lining, nor find the false identity papers. A really thorough search would have found them, but his was the usual perfunctory run-through that would only have become intensive if he had found something suspicious. The component parts of a complete sniper's rifle were only 3 feet away from him across the desk, but he suspected nothing. He closed the case and gestured to the Jackal to lock it again. Then he chalked all 4 cases in quick succession. His job done, the Italian's face broke into a smile. "Grazie, signore. A happy holiday." The porter found a taxi, and soon the Jackal was speeding into Milan. He asked to be taken to the central station. Here, another porter was summoned, and he hobbled after the man to the left luggage office. In the taxi, he had slipped the steel shears out of the overnight case into his trouser pocket. At the left luggage office, he deposited the hand grip and 2 suitcases, retaining the one containing the military overcoat, which also had plenty of spare room. Dismissing the porter, he hobbled into the men's toilet, which was empty, and locked himself into one of the cubicles. With his foot up on the lavatory seat, he clipped silently at the plaster on his foot until it began to drop away, revealing the cotton wool pads beneath that had given the foot the bulk of a normally fractured ankle encased in plaster. When the foot was finally clear of the last remnants of plaster, he put back on the silk sock and the slim leather moccasin which had been taped to the inside of his calf while the foot had been in plaster. The remainder of the plaster and cotton wool he gathered up and deposited down the pan. At the first flushing, half of it jammed, but it cleared at the second. Laying the suitcase on top of the toilet, he laid the series of circular steel tubes containing the rifle side by side among the folds of the coat until the case was full. Then he closed the case, left the cubicle, and went up the steps into the main hall of the station. He could not go back to the left luggage office a fit and healthy man so soon after leaving it as a cripple, so he summoned a porter, explained that he was in a hurry, wished to change money, reclaim his baggage, and get a taxi as soon as possible. The baggage check he thrust into the porter's hand, along with 1,000 lira note, pointing the man towards the left luggage office. He himself, he indicated, would be in the bureau de change, getting his English pounds changed into lira. The Italian nodded happily and went off to get the luggage. The Jackal changed 20 pounds into Italian currency and was just finished when the porter returned with the other 3 pieces of luggage. 2 minutes later, he was in a taxi heading for the Hotel Continental. At the reception desk, He told the clerk, "I believe you have a room for me in the name of Duggan. It was booked by telephone from London some days ago." Just before 8, the Jackal was enjoying the luxury of a shower and shave in his room. Ahead lay cocktails, dinner, and an early night. For the next day, 13th of August, would be extremely busy. The young detective inspector in Superintendent Bryn Thomas's office in Scotland Yard closed the last of the folders he had been allotted to read and looked across at his superior. "Nothing," he said. Thomas himself had finished 5 minutes before and had walked over to the window, standing with his back to the room and staring at the traffic flowing past in the dusk. His instructions from Assistant Commissioner Mallinson had been clear on what he was to look for, but not why. His brief had been to search through the records for details of any top-class political assassins based in the UK, but probably working abroad. From the incessant calls that had been made throughout the afternoon, checking on possible characters turned up in the records and files, each callback had been negative. "Right, that's it then," he said firmly, spinning round from the window. "We've done all we can, and there just isn't anybody who could possibly fit the guidelines laid down in the Commissioner's brief. Pack up the files and take them back to registry. I'll report that a thorough search has revealed that no such character known to us. That's all we can do." "Super. There's one thing that occurred to me while I was checking," said the young detective inspector. "If there is such a man, and he's got British nationality but never operates at home, he wouldn't normally come to the attention of the internal security forces anyway. A man like that has to have a base somewhere, a place to come back to, and chances are he's a respectable citizen in his own country. Perhaps some of the foreign security boys might have something on him." "Oh, it's possible, I suppose," said Thomas doubtfully. "I look into it. But we've done all we can here, so off you go." When the inspector had gone, the idea he had sown remained in Thomas's mind. One of his closest friends, Barry Lloyd, was on the staff of the Foreign Office. Not many people knew that the department for which Lloyd actually worked was the Secret Intelligence Service, sometimes called the SIS, sometimes more simply the Service, and more usually among the public by the incorrect name of MI6. That night, the two men met for a drink in a quiet pub down by the river. "Got a bit of a problem," said Thomas. "Hoped you might be able to help." He explained about the request from Paris and the blank drawn by both criminal records and the special branch. "It occurred to me that if there ever was such a man, and a British one at that, he might be the kind who would never get his hands dirty inside this country. Might just stick to operations abroad. If he'd ever left a trail, maybe it came to the attention of the service." Lloyd stared into his glass. "Is this an official inquiry for information?" he asked. "No, I can't make it that yet. The French request was unofficial. Very delicate, all this. Mustn't get out to the press or anything. Chances are there's nothing here in Britain at all that might help Lebel. I just thought I'd cover all the angles." "Who is this man supposed to be after?" "I've no idea. As I say, the French don't want any publicity. It could even be de Gaulle as far as I know. They certainly seem to be worried enough about it." The two men sipped their beers in silence. "What are you thinking?" asked Thomas after a while. "Well, I don't know if it's anything really," said Lloyd, "but you remember the Philby case? It's still a very sore nerve in our section. It caused a hell of a rumpus inside the service. A lot of people got moved around. Had to be done. He'd blown most of the Arab section, and some others as well. One of the men who had to be moved was our top resident in the Caribbean. About the same time, the dictator of the Dominican Republic, Trujillo, was assassinated on a lonely road outside Ciudad Trujillo. According to the reports, he was killed by partisans. Our man came back to London then, and we shared an office for a while. He mentioned a rumour that Trujillo's car was stopped by a single shot from a marksman with a rifle. Hell of a shot, too. 150 yards at a speeding car. Hit the driver, and he crashed. That was when the partisans closed in and finished off Trujillo. The thing was, rumour had it, the shooter was an Englishman. Did he have a name? I don't know, I don't remember. It was just talk in the office at the time. This colleague of yours, did he write a report? Must have done, I suppose. They must have been filed somewhere. I suppose so, said Lloyd. Could you just have a look at the back files? Asked Thomas. Just to see if the Englishman had a name. Lloyd looked at Thomas for a moment and then smiled. All right, he said, finishing his drink. You get on home. I'll ring you if there's anything that might help. While Thomas and Lloyd were talking over their beer, and the Jackal was scooping the last drops of Zabaglione from the glass in a rooftop restaurant in Milan, Commissaire Lebel attended the first of the meetings in the conference room of the Interior Ministry in Paris. The minister nodded curtly for the meeting to begin. His chef de cabinet spoke first. Over the previous day and night, he said, every customs officer on every border post in France had received instructions to check through the luggage of tall, blonde male foreigners entering France. Passports particularly were to be checked and were to be scrutinized by the DST official at the customs post for possible forgeries. The chief of the DST then made his report. At 7:30 that morning, a call had been intercepted to the number of the Rome Hotel where the 3 OAS chiefs were staying. Since their appearance there 8 weeks before, operators on the international switchboard had been instructed to report all calls placed to that number. The message had been, Kowalski was taken. The Jackal is blown. Repeat, the Jackal is blown. There was silence in the room for several seconds. How did they find out? Asked Lebel quietly from the far end of the table. Marseille, said Roland. It must have been from Marseille. To get Kowalski to come from Rome, we used a bait. An old friend called Grzybowski. The man has a wife and daughter. We kept them all in protective custody until Kowalski was in our hands. Then we allowed them to return home. All I wanted from Kowalski was information about his chiefs. There was no reason to suspect this Jackal plot at the time. There was no reason why they should not know we had got Kowalski. It must have been the Pole who tipped off the agent, Valmy. A positive chapter of inefficiency, snapped Colonel St. Clair. In a way, mused the minister, it might be as well they know their hired gun is blown. Surely they must call the operation off now. Precisely, said St. Clair. The minister is right. They would be crazy to go ahead now. They'll simply call the man off. He isn't exactly blown, said Lebel quietly. We still don't know his name. The forewarning might simply cause him to take extra contingency precautions. False papers. Physical disguises, perhaps. The optimism to which the minister's remark had given birth round the table vanished. I think we better have Commissaire Lebel's report, gentlemen, said the minister. Thus prompted, Lebel outlined the measures he had taken since the previous evening. The growing belief, supported by the check through the French records, that the foreigner could only be on the files of some foreign police force, if at all. The request to make inquiries abroad. The series of person-to-person calls via Interpol to police chiefs of 7 major countries. The replies came in during the course of today, he concluded. So far, none of the 7 countries contacted have been able to come up with any definite leads. Of course, I only tried the 7 most likely countries. The Jackal could be Swiss, or Austrian, or Swedish. One doesn't know. One is feeling in the dark, hoping for a break. Personally, I feel the man has certainly been warned off, said St. Clair icily. What is the position of these inquiries now, Commissaire? Asked the minister. The police forces concerned are continuing their searches, said Lebel, and will let me know if and when they come up with any possible suspects. This public knowledge is precisely what the President was so anxious to avoid, said St. Clair coldly. It is not public knowledge, corrected Lebel. It is extremely private knowledge, confined to a tiny handful of men who carry in their heads secrets that, if revealed, might well ruin half the politicians of their own countries. If they were not discreet, they would not hold the jobs they do. Better a few men should know we're looking for a killer than they should receive invitations to attend the President's funeral, growled Bouvier. Gentlemen, interposed the minister. Enough of this. It was I who authorized Commissaire Lebel to make discreet inquiries among the heads of foreign police services after, he glanced at St. Clair, consulting with the President. The general amusement at the Colonel's discomfiture was ill-concealed. Is there anything else? Asked the minister. There was silence round the table. Then until tomorrow, gentlemen, said the minister briskly, and rose, gathering his papers. The meeting broke up as the clock struck 12 and ushered in Tuesday, the 13th of August. It was just after 12 when Barry Lloyd rang Superintendent Thomas at his home in Chiswick. I found the report we were talking about, he announced. It was marked, No action to be taken. Was any name mentioned? Asked Thomas. Yes, a British businessman on the island who disappeared round that time. He might have had nothing to do with it, but his name was linked in the gossip. Charles Calthrop. Thanks, Barry. I'll follow it up in the morning. The Jackal left his hotel after breakfast, and after numerous inquiries, found himself in one of the back streets of the Porta Garibaldi, a working-class area near the station. Here he found a row of lock-up garages. One of these he hired from the proprietor. In a local hardware store, he bought a set of overalls, a pair of metal clippers, several yards of thin steel wire, a soldering iron, and a foot of solder rod. These he packed into a canvas grip brought at the same store, and deposited the grip in the garage. In the early afternoon, he arrived by taxi at a small car hire firm. Here, he hired a second-hand 1962 vintage Alfa Romeo sports two-seater. He drove the Alfa back to the hotel, parked it in the hotel car park, went up to his room, and retrieved the suitcase containing the component parts of the sniper's rifle. Shortly after tea time, he was back in the Mews Street, where he had hired the lock-up garage. With the door safely shut behind him, the cable from the soldering iron plugged into the overhead light socket, and a high-powered torch lying on the floor beside him to illuminate the underside of the car, he went to work. For 2 hours, he carefully welded the thin steel tubes that contained the rifle parts into the inner flange of the Alfa's chassis. The tubes themselves were each wrapped in a thin sock of sacking material. The steel wire lashed them tightly inside the flange, and the places where the wire touched the chassis edge were spot-welded with the soldering iron. By the time he was finished, the tubes were almost undetectable except to a close search made from underneath the car, and would soon be coated with dust and mud. He packed the overalls, soldering iron, and the remains of the wire into the canvas grip, and dumped it under a pile of old rags in the far corner of the garage. The metal clippers went into the glove compartment set in the dashboard. Dusk was settling again over the city when he finally emerged at the wheel of the Alta, the suitcase shut into the boot. He closed and locked the garage door and drove back to the hotel. Stopping at the reception desk, he asked for his bill to be made up for settlement after dinner and for an alarm call at 5:30 the following morning. That apart from knowing we are aware of the existence of a plot to assassinate the president, the killer cannot know what progress we have made. Therefore, we stand a reasonable chance of apprehending an unsuspecting man as soon as we have him identified under his new name. It could be, of course, mused Colonel Roland, that having learned from Rodin that the plan was exposed in principle, Koltop then left his flat to dispose of the evidence of his preparations. Lebel glanced up at the 2 rows of expectant faces on each side of him. I hope, he said quietly, that the Colonel is right. But supposing he is not, supposing the Jackal has either not received Rodin's message, or received it, but decided to press ahead nevertheless. There was a buzz of consternation. It was at this point that the call from London came through. The bell was gone for 10 minutes, and when he came back, he spoke to a completely silent assembly for a further 5. What do we do now? Asked the minister when he had finished. In his quiet way, without seeming to hurry, Lebel issued his orders like a general deploying his troops, and none of the men in the room, all senior to him in rank, disputed a word. So there we are, he concluded. We will all conduct a quiet and discreet nationwide search for Dagen in his new appearance, while the British police search the records of airline ticket offices, cross-channel ferries, etc. If they locate him first, they pick him up if he's on British soil, or inform us if he has left it. If we locate him inside France, we arrest him. It was not until St. Clair was at home shortly after midnight that he found an audience to listen to his torrent of outrage against this ridiculous little bourgeois policeman. His mistress listened to him with sympathy and understanding, massaging the back of his neck as he lay face down in their bed. It was not until just before dawn, when he was sound asleep, that she could slip away to the hall and make a brief phone call. At 7 in the morning, as the sun was rising, a local gendarme cycled up to the Hôtel du Cerf at Gap, south of Grenoble, dismounted, and entered the lobby. The proprietor, who was already up and busy behind the reception desk, greeted him cheerfully. "Marie-Louise, bring monsieur a cup of coffee," he shouted. "And no doubt he'll take it laced with a little trou normand." The country constable grinned with pleasure. "Here are the cards," said the proprietor, handing over the little white cards filled in the previous evening by the newly arrived guests. "There were only 3 new ones last night." The constable took the cards and put them in the leather pouch on his belt. "Hardly worth turning up for," he grinned. It was not until 8 that he got back to the gendarmerie at Gap with his pouch full of hotel registration cards. These were then taken by the station inspector, who flicked through them idly and put them in the rack, to be taken later in the day to the regional headquarters at Lyon, and then to the archives of Central Records in Paris. Not that he could see the point of it all. The Jackal rose when the sun was already high over the hills, and gave promise of another beautiful summer day. Shortly after 10:30, he left the Hôtel du Cerf, drove into town, and went to the post office to use the long-distance telephone to Paris. When he emerged 20 minutes later, he was tight-lipped and in a hurry. He drove back to the hotel and asked for his bill. While it was being prepared, he went upstairs to pack and carried his suitcases down to the car himself. When the 3 cases were in the boot and the hand grip on the passenger seat, he re-entered the foyer and settled the bill. A few moments later, the roar of the Alpha was heard in the driveway, and the Englishman was gone. Just before midday, several messages came into the office of Claude Lebel. A call from London informed him that Duggan had left London for Brussels on Monday morning. The Sûreté of Brussels rang later to say that Duggan had only spent a few hours in the city and left on the afternoon Alitalia flight to Milan. Lebel at once placed another call with the Milanese police. As he put the phone down, it rang again. This time it was the DST to say that a report had been received that the previous morning, among those entering France from Italy over the Ventimiglia crossing point, had been one Alexander Duggan. As Lebel replaced the receiver, the service regional headquarters of the PJ at Lyon came through. Lebel listened and glanced up at Caron triumphantly. He covered the mouthpiece with his hand. "We've got him. He's registered for 2 days at the Hotel du Cerf in Gap, starting last night." He uncovered the mouthpiece and spoke down it. "Now listen, Commissaire. This is what I want you to do." It was 4:50 p.m. when they hit the Hotel du Cerf. Lebel, who had landed by helicopter on the other side of the town and had been driven to the hotel in a police car, walked up to the front door accompanied by Caron, who carried a loaded and cocked submachine gun under the mackintosh slung over his arm. Lebel listened as the proprietor answered Caron's questions, and his shoulders sagged. They interviewed the staff, examined the bedroom, chased through the grounds. Lebel walked alone out into the drive and stared up at the surrounding hills. Caron joined him. "You think he's really gone, Chief?" said Caron. Lebel nodded. "He's gone, all right. But he was booked in for 2 days. He changed his mind sometime this morning, and he left. The question now is, where the hell has he gone, and does he suspect yet that we know who he is? But he couldn't know that. It must be coincidence." "My dear Lucien, let us hope so." "All we've got to go on now, then, is the car number." "Yes. That was my mistake. We should have put the alert out for the car. Get on to Lyon from one of the squad cars and make it an all-stations alert. Top priority. White Alfa Romeo, Italian. Number MI61741. Approach with caution. Occupant believed armed and dangerous." It was just before 2 in the morning on the Route Nationale 89, about 30 kilometers beyond Ussel, that the Jackal decided to abandon his car. Within a few hundred meters, he had found a drive leading into the forest that bordered the road. He drove half a mile into the forest, stopped the car, switched off the headlights, and took the wire cutters and torch from the glove compartment. He spent an hour underneath the vehicle. At last, the steel tubes containing the sniper's rifle were free from their hiding place, and he repacked them in the suitcase with the old clothes and the army greatcoat. He drove the car hard into the center of a nearby clump of wild rhododendron. He knotted his tie with one end round the handle of one of the suitcases, the other end round the handle of the second case. Using the tie like a railway porter's strap, his shoulder under the loop so that one case hung down his chest and the other down his back, he was able to grab the remaining 2 pieces of baggage in his 2 free hands and start the march back to the road. It took an hour to reach the road and put half a mile between himself and the entrance to the forest. Lining the suitcases up in a row, he sat down to wait as the eastern sky grew a fraction paler than the surrounding night. Country buses, he reminded himself, tend to start early. In fact, he was lucky. A farm lorry towing a trailer of hay came by at 5:50, heading towards the market town. "Car broken down?" bawled the driver as he slowed up. "No. I've got a weekend pass from camp, so I'm hitchhiking home." Got as far as Ussel last night and decided to push on to Toul. I've got an uncle there who can fix me a lorry to Bordeaux. This was as far as I got." He grinned at the driver, who laughed and shrugged. "Crazy. Walking through the night up here. No one comes this way after dark. Jump up on the trailer. I'll take you into Égletons. You can try from there." The driver of the farm lorry put the Jackal down just outside Égletons about an hour later. After the lorry had disappeared from sight, the Jackal turned his back on the town and walked along the way he had just travelled. Coming to a narrow lane running through wooded farmlands, he turned off the main road and trudged along for some time without seeing a soul. At last he found what he was looking for: a deserted, tumble-down old woodcutter's shack, the door hanging half off its hinges. He pushed his way inside and remained in the hut for several hours. Just before midday, anyone watching the door of the hut would have been surprised to see a tall man with short, iron-grey hair emerge, dressed in a conventional black suit and wearing a clerical collar. The pastor was carrying a suitcase in each hand. He walked down the country track to the main road and turned left towards Égletons. Arriving in the town at about 1 o'clock, he lunched at a small inn and made inquiries about local bus services to Toul, from where there was a regular train service to Paris. He arrived in Toul in the early evening and booked in at a small hotel for the night. The proprietor expressed no particular interest in the Danish pastor who was touring France looking at old churches and cathedrals. On the following day, the Paris train arrived at Toul on the dot of 1 o'clock. Among the passengers who boarded it was a grey-haired Protestant pastor. He took a corner seat in a compartment inhabited only by 2 middle-aged women, put on a pair of gold-rimmed reading glasses, took a large book on French ecclesiastical architecture from his hand-grip, and started to read. The daily meeting at the ministry in Paris had been brought forward to 2 in the afternoon. Lebel's report was delivered in his usual inoffensive manner, but the reception was icy. "Damn the man!" exclaimed the minister halfway through. "He has the luck of the devil." "No, Monsieur le Ministre, it hasn't been luck, at least, not all of it. He has been kept constantly informed of our progress at every stage. This is why he left Gap just before the net closed. Every night I have reported my progress to this meeting. Twice we have been within hours of catching him. On both occasions he was tipped off in the early morning after I had briefed this meeting." "I seem to recall, Commissaire," said the minister coldly, "that this suggestion of yours has been made before. I hope you can substantiate it." For answer, Lebel lifted a small portable tape recorder onto the table and pressed the starter button. In the silence of the conference room, the conversation tapped from the telephone sounded metallic and harsh. When it finished, the whole room stared at the machine on the table. Colonel St. Clair had gone ashen grey. His hands trembled slightly as he shuffled his papers together into his folder. "Whose voice was that?" asked the minister finally. Lebel remained silent. St. Clair rose slowly, and the eyes of the room swiveled onto him. "I regret to have to inform you, Monsieur le Ministre, that it was the voice of a friend of mine. She is staying with me at the present moment. Excuse me." He left the room to return to the palace and write his resignation. Those in the room stared at their hands in silence. "Very well, gentlemen." The minister's voice was very quiet. "Let us continue. The President has refused point-blank to change an item of his itinerary for the future, even though he has been informed of the existence of the killer. Frankly, it was to be expected. As soon as you are quite certain as to the new identity under which the Jackal is now masquerading, Commissaire, every policeman and CRS man in Paris will be on the street, stopping every soul in sight to examine his papers. All we want from you now, Commissaire Lebel, is one name, one description, one photograph. And let us pray that we shall be in time. Actually, I think we have several days in which to find the Jackal, said Lebel. I have been very silly not to see it before. For a week now, I've been certain that the Jackal had a plan, and that he had picked his day for killing the President. I believe, gentlemen, that the chosen day is Sunday, the 25th of August. Liberation Day, exclaimed the minister. Exactly, said Lebel. He's a bit of a psychologist, our Jackal. He knows there is one day of the year that General de Gaulle will never spend elsewhere than here. It is, so to speak, his great day. I am firmly convinced that that is what the assassin has been waiting for. In that case, said the minister briskly, we have got him. With his source of information gone, there is no corner of Paris that he can hide, no single community of Parisians that will take him in, even unwittingly, and give him protection. We have him. Commissaire Lebel, give us that man's name. Claude Lebel rose and went to the door. The others were rising and preparing to leave when the minister suddenly said, Oh, Lebel, there is one thing more. How did you know to tap the telephone line of Colonel St. Clair's private flat? Lebel turned in the doorway and shrugged. I didn't, he said. So, last night, I tapped all your telephones. Good day, gentlemen. Pierre Valremy was fed up. He was hot. His blouse was sticking to his back, and the strap of his submachine gun chafed his shoulder through the soaking material. He was beginning to regret joining the CRS at all. See that crowd barrier, Valremy? His sergeant had said. Well, stand by it, watch it, and don't let nobody through it, unless they're authorized. Yours is a responsible job, my lad. Responsible indeed. Mind you, they had gone a bit wild over this Paris Liberation Day, bringing in thousands from the provinces to supplement the Paris troops. Valremy turned and looked back up the Rue de Rennes. The crowd barrier he was guarding was one of a chain stretched across the street from one building to the other, about 250 meters up the street to the Place du 18e Juin. The facade of the railway station was another 100 meters beyond the square, fronted by the forecourt in which the ceremony was to take place. In the distance, he could see some men inside the forecourt marking out the places where the old veterans would stand. 3 hours to go. Jesus, would it never end? There were a couple of hundred spectators scattered along the barriers when he saw the old man. He was hobbling down the street, looking like he was never going to make it, his long greatcoat swishing below his knees. There was a row of medals dangling and clinking on his chest. These old codgers always kept their medals, Valremy thought, like it was the only thing they had in life. Well, maybe it was the only thing left for some of them, especially when you had one of your legs shot off. The old man hobbled up to him. Je peux passer? He asked timidly. Come on, Dad. Let's have a look at your papers. The old man fumbled inside his shirt and produced 2 cards, which Valremy took and looked at. André Martin, French citizen, age 53, resident in Paris. Written across the top of the second card were the words, Mutilé de guerre. Valremy compared the photographs with the face of the man in front of him. It was the same. The old man looked sick. He'd cut himself shaving, and small bits of toilet paper were stuck on the cuts where specks of blood still showed. The face was grey-coloured and greasy with a film of sweat. "What do you want to go down there for?" asked Valremy.
"I live there," said the old man.
The identity card gave his address as 154 Rue de Rennes. The CRS man looked at the house above his head. Written over the door was the number 132. Fair enough. 154 must be further down the road. No orders against letting an old man go home. "All right, pass through," he said. "But don't get into no mischief. Big Charlie's going to be along in a couple of hours." The old man hobbled away down the street. The last thing Valremy saw of him was the flash of the greatcoat disappearing into a doorway at the far end of the street. Madame Berthe looked up startled as the shadow fell over her. It had been a trying day, what with policemen looking in all her rooms, and she didn't know what the tenants would have said if they had been there. Fortunately, they were all away for the August holidays.
"Excusez-moi, madame. I was wondering, perhaps a glass of water? It's terribly hot waiting for the ceremony."
She took in the face and form of an old man in a greatcoat, with medals swinging below the lapel on the left breast. He leaned heavily on a crutch, one single leg protruding from beneath the greatcoat.
"Oh, mon pauvre monsieur, walking around like that, and in this heat. The ceremony is not for 2 hours yet. Come in, come in."
She bustled off towards her parlour at the back of the hall to get a glass of water. The war veteran hobbled after her. Above the running of the water from the kitchen tap, she did not hear the door close on the outer lobby. She hardly felt the fingers of the man's left hand slide under her jawbone, and the crash of the bunched knuckles under the mastoid bone on the right side of her head was completely unexpected. She slid soundlessly to the floor. The Jackal straightened his leg and flexed the cramped knee, his face tightening with pain. He spent several minutes allowing the blood to flow back into his calf and ankle. A search of the parlour revealed Madame Berthe's keys in the table drawer. Leaving the parlour, he locked the door after him and climbed the stairs. On the 6th floor, he chose the flat of Mademoiselle Béranger and knocked. From neither that flat nor the next door one came a sound. Taking the keys, he searched for the name Béranger, found it, and entered the flat, closing and locking the door after him. He stripped off his greatcoat and rolled up his sleeves. The crutch came to pieces section by section. The black rubber ferrule on the end was unscrewed and revealed 3 bullets. The nausea and sweating inspired by eating the cordite was only now beginning to leave him. The next section of the crutch was unscrewed, and from it slid the silencer. The second section came away to disgorge the telescopic sight. From the Y-shaped frame above the join, he slid the 2 steel rods which, when fitted together, would become the frame of the rifle's stock. Lastly, the padded armpit support of the crutch. This concealed the trigger of the rifle, embedded in the padding. The armpit support itself slid onto the stock of the gun to become the shoulder guard. Lovingly and meticulously, he assembled the rifle and slid on the telescopic sight. Then, sitting slightly to one side of the window, with the gun barrel resting on top of a table, he squinted through the sights. The sunlit square beyond the windows and 50 feet down leapt into focus. The head of one of the men marking out the standing positions for the forthcoming ceremony passed along the line of sight. He tracked the target with the gun. The head appeared large and clear. He lined the 3 cartridges up on the edge of the table, slid back the rifle's bolt, and eased the first shell into the breech. He pushed the bolt forward again, gave a half-twist, and locked it. Laying the rifle carefully on the table, he leant back and settled down to wait for another hour and 3/4. For the first time in many years, Lebel was really frightened. Something, he was sure, was going to happen during that afternoon, and he could still find no clue as to how or when. He'd spent a fruitless week trying to discover the Jackal's new identity and whereabouts, but with absolutely nothing to go on, the task was hopeless. He had been at the Arc de Triomphe that morning, and at Notre Dame, and at Mont Valérien. Nothing had happened. Over lunch with some of the men from the committee which had met for the last time at the ministry that day at dawn, he had heard the mood change from tenseness and anger to something almost of euphoria. There was only one more ceremony to go, and the Place du 18e Juin, he was assured, had been scoured and sealed off. The main roads were blocked, the side roads were blocked, the alleys were blocked. The rooftops were watched and guarded, the station itself was crawling with security men. Inside the perimeter, every building had been scoured from basement to attic. Now he stood in the Rue de Rennes, which was blocked off 200 meters from the square, and was empty, except for patrolling CRS men. Down in the square he heard a shouted order, and from one end of the Boulevard de Montparnasse, a motorcade swept in the Place du 18e Juin. He watched it turn into the gates of the station forecourt, police erect and at the salute. On the western side of the Rue de Rennes, a young CRS man stood with his feet planted squarely in the gap where the last crowd barrier abutted the wall. Lebel flashed his card at the man and said, "Anybody passed this way?" "No, sir." "How long have you been here?" "Since 12 o'clock, sir." "And nobody's been through that gap?" "No, sir." "Well, only the old cripple. And he lives down there." "What cripple?" "Oldest chap, sir. He had his ID card and mutilé de guerre card. He looked all in, real sick. Not surprised with him in that great coat in this weather and all." "Great coat?" "Yes, sir. Great long coat, military, like the old soldiers used to wear." "What was wrong with him?" "Only one leg, sir. Hobbling along he was, on a crutch." From down in the square, the first clear peals from the trumpets sounded. Several of the crowd took up the familiar chant of the Marseillaise. "Crutch," said Lebel in a quiet voice. The CRS man looked at him solicitously. "Yes, sir. An aluminium crutch." And then Lebel was herring off down the street, yelling at the CRS man to follow him. The Jackal gazed down at the scene before him. Along the railings that separated the forecourt from the square were the 10 recipients of the medals to be distributed by the head of state. On the east side of the forecourt were the officials and diplomatic corps, and the western side was occupied by the serried red plumes and burnished casques of the Garde Républicaine. The Jackal raised the rifle and squinted down into the forecourt. He picked the war veteran nearest to him, the man who would be first to get his medal. He was a short, stocky man, standing very erect. His head came clearly into the sight, almost a complete profile. In a few minutes, facing this man would be another face, proud, arrogant, topped by a khaki kepi, adorned with 2 gold stars on the front. The last notes of the national anthem died away, replaced by a great silence. The roar of the commander of the guard echoed across the station yard. "General salute! Present arms!" There were 3 precise crashes as white-gloved hands smacked in unison across rifle butts and heels came down together. A single tall figure began to stalk towards the line of veterans. At the end of the street, Lebel stopped, panting, as the CRS man caught up with him. "Which house was it?" he gasped. "This one, sir," said Valremy breathlessly. "Second from the end. This was where he went in." The little detective was gone down the hallway, and Valremy followed him. When he got into the hall, the detective was shaking the door of the concierge's parlour.
Suddenly he smashed the frosted glass panel with his elbow, reached inside, and opened the door. Following him into the room, the CRS man saw the body of the concierge, still unconscious, on the floor. "Top floor!" shouted the detective, and was gone up the stairs with a speed that surprised Valremy, who pounded after him, unslinging his carbine as he ran. The President of France paused before the first man in the line of veterans, and stooped slightly to listen to the minister explain who he was, and what was his citation for valor. When the minister had finished, he turned towards the man with the cushion and took the proffered medal. As the band began playing La Majolaine, the tall general pinned the medal onto the chest of the man in front of him. Then he stepped back for the salute. 6 floors up, and 130 meters away, the Jackal held the rifle very steady and squinted down the telescopic sight. He could see the features quite clearly, the brow shaded by the peak of the cap, the peering eyes, the prow-like nose. He saw the raised, saluting hand come down from the peak of the cap, and the crossed wires of the sight were spot on the exposed temple. Softly, gently, he squeezed the trigger. A split second later, he was staring down into the station forecourt as if he could not believe his eyes. Before the bullet had passed out of the end of the barrel, the President had snapped his head forward without warning. As the assassin watched in disbelief, he solemnly pounded a kiss on each cheek of the man in front of him. As he himself was a foot taller, he had had to bend forward and down to give the traditional kiss of congratulation that is habitual among the French. The bullet had passed a fraction of an inch behind the moving head. Whether the President heard the whip crack from the sound barrier travelling on a narrow line down the flight path of the bullet is not known. He gave no sign of it, and the onlookers themselves heard nothing. The slug tore into the sun-softened tar-macadam of the forecourt, disintegrating harmlessly inside more than an inch of tar. The President, after planting the second kiss, straightened up and moved sedately on towards the next man. Behind his gun, the Jackal swore softly. Then he calmed down. There was still time. He tore open the breech of the rifle, ejecting the spent cartridge. Taking the second one off the table, he pushed it home and closed the breech. Lebel arrived panting on the 6th floor. There were 2 doors leading towards the front of the building. He looked from one to the other as the CRS man joined him, submachine gun at the ready. As they hesitated, a low but distinct "thud" came from behind one of the doors. Lebel pointed at the lock with his forefinger. "Shoot it off," he ordered. The CRS man braced himself on both feet and fired. Bits of wood, metal, and spent slugs flew in all directions. The door buckled and swung drunkenly inwards. Valremy was first into the room, Lebel on his heels. The gunman gave him no time. Rising from his seat behind the table, swinging in one smooth motion at a half-crouch, he fired from the hip. The single bullet made no sound. It tore into Valremy's chest and exploded. Above the body, Lebel stared into the eyes of the other man. He was fumbling with the gun, tearing open the breech. Lebel saw the glint as the cartridge case dropped to the floor. The man swept something off the table and stuffed it into the breech. Valremy's carbine had slipped from his fingers and lay at Lebel's feet. Without conscious thought, he dropped to his knees, grabbed the gun, and swung it upwards. He heard the Jackal snap home the breech of the rifle as his own fingers found the trigger of the carbine and pulled it. The roar of the exploding ammunition filled the small room, and half a magazine of 9mm bullets hit the Jackal in the chest, picked him up, half-turned him in the air, and slammed his body into an untidy heap on the floor. Superintendent Thomas had a phone call at 6 that evening from Paris. He sent for the senior inspector of his staff. "They got him," he said. "In Paris. No problems, but you better get up to his flat and sort things out." It was 8 o'clock when the inspector was having a last sort-through of Calthrop's belongings that he heard someone come into the open doorway. He turned. A man was standing there, scowling at him. A big-built, burly man. "What are you doing here?" asked the inspector. "I might ask you just the same thing. What the hell do you think you're doing?" "All right, that's enough," said the inspector. "Let's have your name." "Calthrop," said the newcomer. "Charles Calthrop, and this is my flat. Now what the hell are you doing to it?" "All right," said the inspector quietly. "I think you better come down to the yard for a little chat." "Too bloody right," said Calthrop. "You've got a bit of explaining to do." But in fact, it was Calthrop who did the explaining. They held him for 24 hours, until 3 separate confirmations came through from Paris that the Jackal was dead, and 5 landlords of isolated taverns in the far north of Sutherland County, Scotland, had testified that Charles Calthrop had indeed spent the previous 3 weeks indulging his passion for climbing and fishing, and had stayed at their establishments. "If the Jackal wasn't Calthrop," asked Thomas of his inspector when Calthrop finally walked out of the door a free man, "then who the hell was he?" The following day, the body of a man was buried in an unmarked grave at a suburban cemetery in Paris. The death certificate showed the body to be that of an unnamed foreign tourist, killed in a hit-and-run accident. Nobody present showed any interest as the plain deal coffin was lowered into the grave. When it was all over, Lebel turned round and walked back down the cemetery path, a solitary little figure, to return home to his wife and children. The day of the Jackal was over.